The fluorescent strip lights in waste processing level 5 cast a jaundiced glow over the grimy machinery. They sputtered and died every few minutes, plunging me into a brief, heart-stopping darkness before struggling back to life. Typical. Everything down here was on its last legs, just like the poor bastards condemned to work in the bowels of this rust bucket. Another flicker, another plunge, and I slammed my fist against the light's control panel. It responded with a shower of sparks and another bout of darkness. I swore under my breath. Not that anyone would hear me over the gnashing and groaning of the compactors. It had been 300 cycles since we left Earth, or so they said. 300 cycles of this. I'm Dustin, though most on the ship call me Scrap, a name I've earned. Not that I mind. Out here, titles are about as useful as tits on a bull. I run the waste management down here. It's not a glamorous job, but it's mine. I know every pipe, every duct, every grinding gear, and every leak. Level 5, it is a place where what is discarded is king. I stared into the maw of the primary compactor, its massive hydraulic rams rising and falling, crushing the refuse of the void colony into tidy, manageable cubes. It wasn't just physical waste, not really. It was the cast-off remnants of lives, the detritus of a society slowly eating itself alive. The shiny boots up top in their pristine sectors, they liked to pretend that everything was fine, orderly, efficient. They never saw this side of things. They flushed their waste and forgot about it. But I saw it. The uneaten synth protein, the broken trinkets, the frayed edges of a society stretched thin. The boots would be better prepared for this journey if they did. It had been, 30 cycles since my incident. 30 cycles since I became void-touched. That's what they called it anyway. A nice, neat label for something they didn't understand and didn't want to. One moment I was on a routine inspection in a waste disposal airlock, and the next was a blur. A searing pain, a blinding flash of light from nowhere, like staring into the heart of a dying star. And then, darkness. They found me unconscious, sprawled on the floor, my left eye milky white, useless. My pinky finger was gone, vanished. They never did tell me what happened. The doctors poked and prodded and ran their scans. Then they discharged me back down here with a pat on the back and a bottle full of painkillers, muttering about stress and prolonged exposure to the recycled air. But I knew it was more than that. It felt like a piece of me was ripped away, replaced with something else, something cold, empty. Sometimes when the ship was quiet, I'd feel it, a strange sensation, like a missing limb that still aches, a hollowness that screamed to be filled. The docs called it phantom pain, prescribed me some pills and told me to get back to work. Pills that made me sluggish and clouded my thoughts, pills I stopped taking weeks ago. I preferred the sharp clarity of pain to their dull haze. I needed to stay sharp, especially now, especially with the way things were changing. Lately, I had started noticing things, small things at first, anomalies in the waste stream, a strange, black, viscous residue that clung to the compactor walls, a substance that wasn't on any inventory manifest. It moved almost imperceptibly, contracting and expanding like a living thing. It resisted the normal cleaning protocols, clinging stubbornly to surfaces and emitting an acrid odor that stung my nostrils and made my eyes water. I'd reported it, of course, filled out the proper forms, just like a good little worker. Nash, my foreman, a company man through and through, just laughed and told me to stop sniffing the damn garbage. He said it was probably just some new lubricant the engineers were using, or a byproduct of the algae tanks malfunctioning again. But I knew better. I spent half my life down here, elbow deep in the refuse of this ship, and I knew this wasn't normal. A tremor, like the shudder of a dying beast, worked its way up through the soles of my boots, rattling the loose fillings in my back teeth. It wasn't the usual rumble of the zero-point energy generators. This was different, more erratic, like the heartbeat of some massive, dying beast. The lights flickered again, this time staying off for a full 10 seconds. 10 seconds of absolute darkness, filled only with the grinding of the compactor and the frantic pounding of my own heart. When they finally came back on, I saw it again. A dark stain, spreading across the floor, a pool of that same black, viscous residue. It was larger this time, and it was moving, flowing towards the main drainage pipe, defying gravity, as if drawn by an invisible force. It was definitely not a lubricant. I grabbed a heavy-duty cleaning tool, a high-pressure hose used for disinfecting the waste chutes, and approached the spreading stain cautiously. It reacted to my presence, the edges rippling, the surface tension changing, becoming almost mirror-like. I aimed the hose at the stain and pulled the trigger. The high-pressure stream hit the substance, but instead of washing it away, it seemed to energize it. The residue expanded rapidly, lashing out like a tentacle, striking the control panel of the compactor. The machinery shuddered, the hydraulic rams stalled, and a piercing alarm shrieked through the level. I stumbled back, dropping the hose. The stain, now larger, grew and receded, its internal light intensifying and dimming in a jarring rhythm. It was definitely, undeniably, alive. Panic pierced through my fear. I needed to report this, needed to get out of here. I turned to run, to head for the comm panel at the far end of the room, but I froze. The stain was moving again, faster now, flowing towards the main access corridor, towards the rest of the ship. I couldn't let it escape, not before knowing what it was capable of. I had a responsibility. To the ship, to the crew, even the shiny boots who looked down on me. Maybe it was stupidity. Maybe it was the lingering effects of the void touch. But I couldn't just stand by and let this thing, whatever it was, spread through the colony. The stain began to move faster, not just spreading, but flowing with purpose toward the access corridor, towards the rest of the ship. I charged ahead, swinging the rebar like a club, aiming for the center of the mass. The metal rod connected, and the stain recoiled, its form rippling violently. It wasn't a solid, but it wasn't a liquid either. It was something else. My blow seemed to cause it pain, or at least disrupt its movement, but it didn't disperse it. Instead, the stain split into 3 smaller but faster-moving blobs. 2 shot forward, sliding up the walls, avoiding my swings, heading straight for the access corridor. I cursed, knowing I couldn't block them both. This thing was smart, smarter than I anticipated. But the third one, the largest portion of the original stain, turned towards the massive waste intake pipe, the one that led down to the deepest, darkest part of Level 5, the sub-level incinerator. This pipe was wide enough to accommodate large objects, and this remaining blob was definitely large enough to fit. It slithered towards the wide, circular opening of the pipe with alarming speed. I made a split-second decision. The access corridor led to populated areas, while the intake pipe, for now, was a dead end, leading only to the incinerator. I could try to block one of the smaller stains heading for the corridor, potentially slowing it down, or I could focus on the larger mass, the one that seemed to be the main part of the entity. If I could stop it, maybe the others would dissipate. I sprinted towards the intake pipe, swinging the rebar again, trying to herd the black blob away from the opening. It was like trying to wrestle smoke. The rebar passed through it, offering little resistance, but the air displacement seemed to push it back slightly. With a final surge, it poured itself into the pipe and vanished into the darkness, leaving only a faint, oily residue around the rim. I stood there, chest heaving, rebar hanging limply in my hand, staring into the black abyss of the intake pipe. I had to report this, had to warn someone. But who would believe the ravings of a void-touched scrap rat? I made my way to the comm panel. The screen activated, displaying the impassive geometric logo of the collective, the AI that governed our lives. I navigated through the menus and filed a report, detailing the events as clearly and concisely as I could. Anomalous biological entity, I typed. Unidentified substance. Potential threat to ship integrity. I hesitated before adding, observed directional movement and splitting of the entity. There. It was done. Now, all I could do was wait. Except, waiting wasn't exactly my forte, and the silence of level 5, broken only by the drip of some unknown fluid from a leaky pipe, was starting to get to me. I decided to head back to my hab unit. Maybe a ration pack and a few hours of restless sleep would clear my head. The corridors of level 5 were deserted, as usual. Most of the crew avoided this sector, and those who did work here were probably already in their bunks, trying to grab some sleep before their next shift. As I walked, I noticed more signs of the anomalies. Dark, oily patches on the walls, clustered around electrical conduits and ventilation grills, almost as though they were feeding off the ship's energy. The metal beneath my boots felt brittle in places, as if the integrity of the material was compromised. My hab unit was located in Sector 7, a residential block for lower deck personnel. It was a cramped, windowless cubicle, barely large enough for a bunk, a storage locker, and a tiny recycler unit. Home sweet home. I swiped my access card and the door opened, revealing the familiar interior. I collapsed onto the bunk, the events of the past few hours replaying in my mind. The image of the black, oily mass, its unnatural movements, its chilling intelligence, was seared into my memory. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and filled with disturbing dreams. I saw the ship consumed by the blackness, saw the faces of the crew contorted in terror, heard the screams echoing through the corridors. I woke up in a cold sweat, the taste of fear in my mouth, the image of the black mass still vivid in my mind. The next morning, I went straight to the mess hall, hoping for some answers. The hall was located in a communal area on level 4, one level above the waste processing. It was a large, noisy space, filled with the clatter of trays and the murmur of conversation. The food was the usual bland, recycled protein, but it was hot and filling. I scanned the room, looking for a familiar face, someone I could talk to, someone who might believe me. I spotted Tobias, a maintenance tech everyone called Old Man, even though he was probably only in his 50s. He had worked the lower levels for decades and knew the ship's guts better than anyone, or so he claimed. He was a cynical guy who had seen it all and believed very little. Still, he respected experience, and he'd been around long enough to know when something was truly off. "Tobias," I said, approaching his table. He looked up, his one good eye narrowed, the other replaced by a cheap, ill-fitting prosthetic. "Scrap. What do you want?" "Seen anything strange lately?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "Anomalies? Malfunctions?" He snorted. "This whole damn ship is an anomaly, and it malfunctions on a daily basis." "No, I mean something different," I said. I told him about the black, oily stains, the strange objects, the encounter in the waste processing center. He listened, his face betraying no feelings. When I was finished, he took a long swig of his recycled coffee, which smelled suspiciously like engine coolant, and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "You been hitting the pain meds again, Scrap?" he asked, his voice gruff. "Seeing things that ain't there." "I'm serious, Tobias," I insisted. "This is real. Something's wrong with the ship." He sighed, a sound like air escaping a punctured tire. "Look, kid, I've seen a lot of weird stuff in my time. This ship is old, and it's got its quirks. Things break down, systems malfunction. It's the way of things. Doesn't mean there's some kind of monster lurking in the pipes. But nothing," he cut me off. "You filed your report. Let the collective handle it. That's what it's there for." His words were dismissive, but I saw a flicker of something in his good eye. Uncertainty, fear, or maybe it was just the bad lighting in the mess hall. Before I could press him further, the overhead comms activated with a sharp tone. "Attention, crew," a calm, modulated voice announced, the voice of the collective. "Minor malfunctions have been reported in various sectors. Maintenance crews are addressing the issues. Please remain calm and continue your duties." The announcement was followed by a series of updates, each one detailing a different malfunction. A power fluctuation in Sector 3. A life support hiccup in Sector 9. A structural breach quickly sealed, it said, in Sector 6, not too far from my HAB unit. Nothing was said about Level 5, about the waste processing center or the entity I had encountered. It was as if my report had been ignored, swallowed up by the vast, indifferent bureaucracy of the collective. As the day wore on, the malfunctions became more severe, escalating from inconvenient to downright bizarre. It wasn't just the lights going out and temperatures fluctuating anymore. Now, it was far more unsettling. In the mess hall, during the evening meal, the gravity fluctuated, not drastically but enough to send unsecured objects floating around the room. People's hair stood on end, as if charged with static electricity, and a low tremor ran through the deck plates. It felt like the ship was breathing. One crewman swore he saw his reflection in a bulkhead panel blink when he didn't, while another reported that the nutritional paste dispensers in his sector were dispensing random objects instead of food. A handful of rusty bolts, a perfectly formed tooth, far too large to be human, a length of frayed rope that writhed slightly when touched. Then there were the screams. Not screams of pain or terror, but screams of confusion, of minds unraveling. They echoed through the corridors, impossible to trace, each one abruptly cut short, as if the screamer had suddenly forgotten how to make the sound, or perhaps forgotten how to be human. The unsettling part wasn't just the screams themselves, but the reactions of those who heard them. Instead of rushing to help, people froze, their eyes wide and unfocused, their faces pale and slack, as if they were listening to something else, something beyond the screams. I tried to talk to others, to warn them, but my words were met with skepticism, fear, or outright hostility. My reputation as a void-touched outcast preceded me. They saw me as a crazy old man, a relic of a bygone era, a troublemaker. "It's the stress," they said, "the isolation. It's getting to all of us. Just ignore it," others advised. "The collective will take care of it." The malfunctions were getting worse, no doubt about it. It seemed like every time I turned around, another system was failing. Another alarm was blaring. Another poor bastard was losing his grip on reality. The mess hall was filled with the sounds of dropped trays and muttered curses. The gravity fluctuations were becoming more intense. I saw a guy get slammed into the ceiling during one particularly violent shift. He was part of the sanitation crew, just like me, only younger. He looked terrified. And then there were the screams. Those confused, disoriented screams that echoed through the corridors, followed by that strange, unsettling silence from everyone who heard them. It was like the ship itself was rejecting us, trying to shake us off like fleas. One shift, while hauling a load of compacted waste to the incinerator, I saw Nash, my foreman, standing by the main conveyor belt, his face contorted in a grimace. He was always a sour-faced bastard, but this was different. It wasn't just his usual cynicism, this was strain. He was clutching his head, muttering something I couldn't quite make out. Then I saw it. A thin, viscous trickle of that same black, oily substance I'd encountered in the compactor, oozing from his ear, staining the collar of his coveralls. It was barely noticeable, a tiny rivulet against the grime of his uniform, but to me, it was like a searchlight in the darkness. My stomach clenched. It was the same damn stuff. The same stuff that had moved, that had split apart and escaped. The realization hit me. It wasn't just a malfunction. It wasn't just some random glitch in the system. It was an infection. And Nash, poor grumpy Nash, was patient zero, or at least one of them. The black goo, the entity, whatever it was spreading, using the crew as hosts, as incubators or food. Over the next few days, my paranoia, once a simmering ember, ignited into a full-blown blaze. I started watching people more closely, scrutinizing every face, every gesture. Once you knew what to look for, it was sickeningly obvious. The barely perceptible trickle from the ear, the slight discoloration around the ear canal, the glazed, unfocused look in their eyes, the way they moved, slightly off-kilter, like puppets whose strings were being pulled by an inexperienced puppeteer. I tried to warn them. I tried to tell them what I'd seen, what I suspected. "You're sick," I'd say, grabbing their arms, trying to get them to look at me, to understand. "There's something inside you, something alien." But my words were like pebbles tossed into a hurricane. They either ignored me, their minds lost in some personal hallucination, or they pushed me away, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and fear. "Get away from me, Scrap," they'd mutter. "You're not well." They didn't understand. Their minds were already compromised, their thoughts clouded by the entity's influence. They were seeing things, hearing things, experiencing their own private realities, while the ship fell apart around them. It was like trying to explain color to a man born blind. And then, a chilling thought struck me. I hadn't seen the black substance leaking from my own ears. I checked every day, multiple times a day, in the cracked mirror in my HAB unit, using a small flashlight to peer into my ear canal. Nothing. Why wasn't I infected? The incident 30 cycles ago, the one that had left me with a useless eye and a missing finger, the one that had filled me with unsettling emptiness. That was it. That was the key. Somehow that event had changed me, had made me immune. The entity had been there, back then, in some form, in that blinding flash of light, in that searing pain. It had touched me, marked me, but instead of infecting me, it had granted me resistance. The weight of this realization was immense. I was an outcast, a freak, but I was also possibly the only one who could stop this. But how? I was just a waste management technician, a scrap hauler. I wasn't a scientist or an engineer or a soldier. I needed help. I needed someone in authority, someone who would believe me, someone who wasn't infected. But who? The ship was falling apart, the crew was losing their minds, and the collective, our omnipresent AI guardian, was either oblivious or indifferent. Then I thought of Commander Croft, head of security. A shiny boot, yes, but one with a reputation for strict, unwavering adherence to protocol. He was a man of logic, of order, a man who demanded proof. He was also known for his sharp mind and his dedication to the ship's safety, even if his methods were often seen as harsh. He was my best bet, maybe my only one, but I needed to be careful. I needed evidence, something concrete, something even Croft couldn't dismiss. I decided to go back to where it all started. Level 5, the Waste Processing Center. If the entity was still there, if I could somehow capture a sample, document its behavior, maybe I could convince Croft. The Waste Processing Center was even more chaotic than before. The black, oily substance was everywhere, spread across the floor, coating the walls, dripping from the ceiling. It seemed to be actively seeking out the ship's energy sources, drawn to them like a moth to a flame. I couldn't just call Croft and expect him to come down here based on my word. Shiny boots didn't trust scrap haulers. I needed proof, something undeniable. Using improvised containers, discarded ration tins, salvaged metal canisters, I collected samples of the substance. It wasn't easy. The stuff was difficult to contain, constantly shifting, trying to escape, as if it were aware of my intentions. It reacted to my presence, its surface rippling, the internal glow intensifying, then dimming erratically. I managed to trap some of it, sealing the containers as best as I could. Armed with my samples, I set out to find Commander Croft. It was time to present my case, to convince him, before the entire ship succumbed to the spreading contamination. If I could get him to believe me, to take action, then maybe we could still stop this thing before it consumed us all. I made my way to the security headquarters, a brightly lit section of the ship that felt a world away from the grimy depths of Level 5. This was shiny boot territory, and I felt acutely out of place, a rusty cog in a gleaming machine. Getting an audience with Commander Croft was, unsurprisingly, like trying to get an audience with the collective itself. I spent hours in the waiting area outside his office, surrounded by uniformed security personnel who eyed me with suspicion. My grimy coveralls and the collection of sealed, improvised containers now vibrating slightly I was carrying didn't exactly inspire confidence. I could only imagine what they were thinking. Probably that I was some lunatic from the lower levels who had finally cracked. Maybe I was. Finally, the door to Croft's office opened, and a young, severe-looking ensign gestured me inside. "Commander Croft will see you now." Croft's office was as stark and functional as the man himself. No personal touches, just a desk, a few chairs, and a large view screen displaying a schematic of the ship. Croft, a tall, imposing figure with close-cropped grey hair and eyes as cold and hard as the ship's hull, was standing by the view screen, studying the data with a critical eye. He didn't acknowledge me at first, letting me stand there like a specimen under a microscope. "Commander," I began, my voice rougher than usual. "I know why you're here, Kemp," he interrupted, his voice sharp and precise. "You reported an anomaly, an entity." He turned to face me. "And you've brought samples." He nodded towards the containers I was holding. I placed the containers on his desk, the metal clinking against the smooth surface. "It's real, sir. It's spreading, infecting the crew." I explained everything, from the initial encounter in the waste processing center, to the black substance leaking from Nash's ear, to my theory about the void touch and my own immunity. Croft listened patiently, his hands clasped behind his back. He asked pointed questions, probing for details, testing the veracity of my claims. He examined the containers, his eyes narrowed in scrutiny. The way he held himself, the way he spoke, it was clear he wasn't a man to be trifled with. But he was also a man of logic, a man who valued evidence. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the containers. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the faint vibration of the black substance within. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and serious. "I believe you, Kemp." Relief washed over me, so potent it almost buckled my knees. He believed me. Thank the void, he believed me. "But," he continued, his voice hardening, "belief is not enough. We need proof, concrete, irrefutable proof." He ordered a discreet investigation, mobilizing a small team to verify my claims. They secretly examined crew members, focusing on those exhibiting the symptoms I described. They analyzed samples of the black substance, comparing them to the ones I provided. The results were undeniable. The black substance was present in the affected crew members, and its behavior matched my observations. It was a life form, an alien entity, and it was spreading through the ship, feeding on the crew's negative emotions, amplifying their fears and anxieties, and using the ship's energy grid to reproduce. Croft acted swiftly and decisively. He quarantined the most affected sectors, including large parts of the lower levels, isolating the infected from the rest of the population. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the best we could do under the circumstances. He then assembled a team of scientists and engineers, hand-picked for their expertise and their ability to work under pressure. Among them was Chief Medical Officer Dr. Lila West, a name I hadn't heard before. She was apparently some kind of medical genius, known for her unconventional methods and her sharp intellect. She barely looked old enough to be a doctor, let alone the chief medical officer, but the intensity in her eyes, the sharpness of her movements spoke volumes. She was explaining her findings to Croft and a handful of other officers, her voice rapid fire, her hands gesturing animatedly. I stood on the periphery, trying to follow her technical jargon, feeling like a rusty cog in a finely tuned machine. The entity's bioelectric field directly interferes with the neurotransmitters in the human brain, she was saying, pointing to a complex diagram projected on the wall, a swirling mess of colors and lines that was supposed to represent a neural pathway. Specifically, it inhibits the release of serotonin and dopamine, while amplifying the production of cortisol and adrenaline. This creates a feedback loop, a vicious cycle of fear and anxiety that the entity feeds on. Then she turned her attention to a small, innocuous-looking vial filled with a clear liquid. "This," she declared, holding up the vial, "is the key, my medication. It's a synthetic serotonin reuptake inhibitor, usually prescribed for a rare neurochemical disorder. But it also has an unexpected side effect. It disrupts the entity's ability to interface with the human nervous system. It blocks its access, like a firewall." She was also, as I later learned, immune to the entity, not because of some void touch, but because of a rare medical condition that required her to take a specific medication. A medication that, coincidentally, counteracted the entity's effects. She explained her theory, how a modified, concentrated version of the medication could be used to force the entity out of the infected crew members. It was a radical idea, bordering on insane. But it was the first glimmer of hope we'd had since this whole nightmare began. I found myself drawn into her orbit, her confidence infectious. It might be possible to synthesize a more potent version and even disperse it through the ventilation system. A voice spoke up. It was an older man, his face etched with the weariness of someone who had spent a lifetime working in the bowels of the ship. He introduced himself as Wallace, one of the senior engineers responsible for maintaining the ship's life support and environmental systems. He had been following Dr. West's work with keen interest, recognizing the potential of her discovery. Apparently, he had specialized in the type of systems that would be needed to make her theory a reality. In the next few days, Dr. West and her team worked on isolating the active compound in her medication, experimenting with different formulations to find the most effective way to weaponize it against the entity. They used samples of the black substance, taken from infected crew members, subjecting them to various concentrations of the compound. Wallace proved to be an invaluable asset, his knowledge of the ship's systems crucial in modifying equipment for their experiments. I watched, fascinated, as the black goo recoiled from the medication, its movements becoming sluggish, its vibrant, oily sheen dimming. It was like watching a predator become prey. In one particularly striking experiment, a sample of the entity, placed in a sealed culture flask, usually used for growing biological samples, literally tried to climb the walls to escape the medication, its movements desperate, almost frantic. "It's like it's allergic to it," Dr. West murmured, her eyes fixed on the writhing substance. "The compound destabilizes its bioelectric field, disrupts its ability to maintain cohesion." They finally developed a method to refine and concentrate the compound, creating a potent solution that could be administered en masse. Wallace, with his engineering expertise, devised a way to vaporize the solution and disperse it through the ship's ventilation system, a network of ducts and conduits that reached every corner of the colony. The plan was audacious. We were going to flood the entire ship with a substance that would expel the entity from every infected crew member simultaneously. We had no idea how the entity would react, how it would behave when forced out into the open. But we were out of options. It was our only chance to reclaim the ship. Commander Croft, after careful consideration, gave the order. The dispersal began, the modified compound hissing into the ventilation system, carried on recycled air, a silent, invisible weapon against an unseen enemy. The effects were immediate and dramatic. Throughout the ship, infected crew members began to experience the expulsion process. It wasn't pretty. The black substance, once hidden within their bodies, seeped out from their ears, their noses, their mouths, staining their skin, their clothes, the floor. They thrashed, they retched, they screamed, their bodies convulsing as the entity was forcibly ejected. I watched it happen in the mess hall during the evening meal. One moment people were eating, talking, going about their routines. The next, they were writhing on the floor, black goo pouring from their orifices, their faces contorted in pain and confusion. It was a scene straight out of a nightmare. The uninfected among us, myself included, could only watch in horror, feeling pity and revulsion. Then, something even more extraordinary began to happen. The expelled entity, no longer anchored to a human host, began to move, to flow together. The individual droplets, the small rivulets, coalesced, drawn by some invisible force, forming larger and larger masses of black, oily goo. The ship's internal sensors, now repurposed to track the entity, showed it retreating, flowing back towards its point of origin, back towards Level 5, the waste processing center. It was a mass exodus, a desperate flight back to the familiar depths from which it had emerged. Croft ordered the evacuation of Level 5, sealing off the sector, transforming it into a containment zone. We had to prevent the entity from escaping, from finding a new way to spread. And that's where I came in. "Kemp," Croft said, "you know Level 5 better than anyone. I need you to lead a team down there. We need to contain this thing, herd it towards the primary waste ejection port. Can you do it?" It wasn't a question, not really, it was a command. And I knew I couldn't refuse. I was void-touched, immune to the entity's influence, and intimately familiar with the depths of Level 5. It was my responsibility. It felt like it was always meant to come back to me, back to where it all began. "Yes, sir, I can do it." Wallace and a handful of security personnel, equipped with modified containment units, devices that emitted a focused energy field that repelled the entity, forming a kind of mobile barrier, were assigned to my team. We entered Level 5, a ghost town now. The waste processing center was a scene of utter chaos. The black substance was everywhere, coating the walls, the floor, the machinery, a seething mass that filled the main chamber. It was larger than I had ever seen it, a single gargantuan entity, its surface roiling, its movements agitated, almost angry. The containment units, thankfully, worked as advertised. The entity recoiled from the energy fields, its movements becoming sluggish, hesitant when confronted by the barriers. We worked in tandem, using the units to push the entity, to herd it towards the waste ejection port, a massive circular opening in the floor, usually used to dispose of compacted waste. We pushed, we herded, we corralled, inch by agonizing inch, forcing the entity towards the ejection port. Finally, we had it cornered. The massive bulk of the entity pressed against the circular opening, its movements restricted. I approached the control panel for the waste ejection airlock, my hand hovering over the activation switch. This was it, the final purge. The airlock, normally used for ejecting compacted waste, followed a basic principle: 2 doors and a single chamber designed to cycle between the ship's internal pressure and the vacuum of space. I initiated the sequence. First, the inner door, separating the airlock from the waste processing center, sealed shut, isolating the chamber. Then, the automated systems began the decompression process, gradually reducing the air pressure within the airlock. I could hear the pumps working, the air being vented away, the metal groaning under the changing pressure. The entity seemed to sense the change, its movements becoming more frantic, desperate. It pushed against the containment fields with renewed vigor. The built-in sensors indicated that the decompression was complete. It was time for the next step. I activated the outer door mechanism. The outer door, a massive, reinforced barrier designed to withstand the vacuum of space, began to retract. It moved slowly, opening directly to the exterior of the ship. With the outer door open, the entity, driven by the pressure differential and repelled by our containment fields, was forced out into the void. The monitors, connected to sensors within the airlock, displayed its progress as a shifting, black mass on the schematic, rapidly moving away from the ship. The sensors registered a sudden drop in mass within the chamber, indicating a successful ejection. I watched the data on the monitors, the black mass, once so terrifying, so insidious, shrinking on the schematic, finally disappearing altogether, ejected into the black abyss. It was gone. It took a few more minutes for the airlock to complete its cycle, repressurizing and resetting for normal operation. Then, the all-clear signal was given. The aftermath was a period of recovery, of healing, of trying to make sense of what we had experienced. The crew, though shaken, slowly returned to their routines. The medication, it turned out, had no lasting negative effects, though the memory of the infection, the feeling of being invaded, of losing control, lingered. Dr. West continued her research, analyzing the residual traces of the entity, hoping to unlock the secrets of its biology, its origins. The medication became a standard part of the ship's medical protocols, a safeguard against any future encounters. Wallace, his expertise now recognized, was given a new role, overseeing the implementation of new safety measures, ensuring that the ship was better prepared for the unknown. And me? I was no longer just scrap, the void-touched outcast. I was the one who had faced the entity, who had helped to save the ship. I found myself in an unexpected position, a liaison between the shiny boots and the lower levels, my knowledge of the ship's underbelly suddenly valued, my voice finally heard. The colony continued its journey, forever changed by its encounter with the entity. We had stared into the abyss, and the abyss had stared back. But we had survived. We had adapted. We had learned. And we were stronger, more united, more aware of the delicate balance between humanity and the vast, unforgiving cosmos. The lower levels, once neglected, were now seen as vital, their inhabitants no longer just cogs in the machine, but an integral part of the ship's survival. We had faced the darkness within ourselves, and we had emerged not unscathed but unbroken. The void was still out there, vast and unknowable, but we were no longer just drifting. We were navigating.